Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Today's review is the fifth scenario from A Night at the Opera, The Star Chamber for Delta Green the role-playing game by Arcdream Publishing. Available in 2017 as part of the first Delta Green Kickstarter, this scenario was originally released as a 40-page print-on-demand supplement before being collected here. There will be spoilers from this point forward, so stop watching now if you intend to play this. Now, before we go into the scenario itself, I think it would be beneficial to explain some of the concepts at work. Firstly, there is the Akira Kurosawa movie Rashomon, which tells the tale of the confusion surrounding a violent encounter between a samurai, his wife and a bandit, which leaves the samurai dead, and conflicting stories around whether he died in the fight, committed seppuku, or was murdered by his wife. The second concept is that around what the original Star Chamber was, a 15th century British court that judged the cases of prominent and powerful people, where they were examined in secret so as to not be able to influence the court proceedings. The third is the country of Myanmar, formerly the British Crown colony of Burma. It was seized by the military in 1962 and changed the name to Myanmar in 1989, though the language is still referred to as Burmese. The final concept is the people known as the Chow Choir, known elsewhere as the Chow Choir and JoJo's, and by others the Cho Cho in the 19th century. It is suspected that these people are a branch of humanity that worships inhuman patrons that have foul traditions and practices, or that they are even a completely inhuman race that can pass for human, even to the point of interbreeding, though nobody knows for sure. It is well known that they are cruel and cannibalistic, and that every contact that Delta Green has had with them has led to the manifestation of unnatural horror. The Star Chamber is designed for agents from the official Delta Green program and can be used as a self-contained one-off, maybe to take the heat off the players for a few sessions, though it is for established agents. The basic premise is that on a recent Delta Green mission, something went horribly wrong and the players have been tasked with figuring out what exactly happened and recommend the fates of those that survived. The disaster happened in Myanmar and was codenamed Tiger Island, and the agents who were on the mission have been given aliases for the purpose of interrogation. They are otherwise known as Task Force TI or TFTI. The scenario was played with two sets of characters, with the players controlling their usual ones in the present and judging the evidence presented by the survivors, henceforth known as the primary characters. The players also control members of TFTI in flashback scenes and in the present when they are giving evidence. These are known as secondary characters. The flashback scenes are not shown in a factual manner, but from the point of view of a survivor, with each of them giving a different account and presenting the others in a bad light. Task Force TI were deep in Myanmar territory, so a team cannot be sent by Delta Green to check the facts. They all blame each other for the mission failing. The scenario is played out in 9 scenes, following a rough present, past format. The secondary agents are Jenny, a linguistic professor who has had her mind altered by the Aklo language, more on that later. Mona, a former Marine and Delta Green team leader whose mind has snapped and is currently in a wheelchair and is fairly out of it. Pete, a former Marine and Customs Service Special Agent who died on the mission. Rick, a Foreign Service officer who has Aklo scars on his leg that say, "This receptacle has been found acceptable by the greedy fertility power." Jenny knows this, though she may or may not have told him. And Toby, an Export Enforcement officer who despises the Chow Choir. There are also a number of key NPCs in this scenario. The primary team's handler and some Delta Green security guards. Bogyakay Arunhitai, a captain in the Tatmadaw Kyi, or the Myanmar army, who had one of his units attacked by something unnatural and is one of Mona's contacts. Kim Mungai, a person who runs a bar and brothel at the location, who has bad things to say about the Chow Choir. Lo Ming, a Chinese academic who operates out of Hong Kong, who is a Chow Choir researcher who traded one of their texts to Jenny for a necklace that she stole from Rick. Nang Win, a middle-aged woman at the village location who drew the secondaries into a firefight where Pete died. And Liang, a contact of Rick's who gave him the Chow Choir necklace. It then goes on to highlight some key terms that are used throughout the scenario. Chaldeok Fialuk, the Chow Choir for the singer in the skin, a patron god of theirs in the Kayan state that is bound under the location TI-20, more on that later. Choi Hubwei, the Chow Choir for the green giver of discipline, a patron god who is responsible for the compliance of slaves and livestock. Tatmadaw Kyi and Tatmadaw Lai, that are the Myanmar Army and Air Force respectively. And 3 Hukruk, the Chow Choir for Punisher of Inferior Disbelievers, the monster that attacked Bogyakay's unit. It also lists Task Force TI's languages, with Jenny standing out as being proficient in Aklo, and Mona being able to recognise it, but hurting her head when she does. Okay, so with all of these key concepts in mind, we move on to the scenario itself. The players receive a phone call from their control officer, who has arranged for them to have paid leave from their respective employers. Everything's paid for, their employer's placated, and they fly into Chicago's Midway International Airport for what their control officer assures them is a dry situation, meaning it's safe. They are driven to a 4-storey brick factory that is fenced in and dark, being told that it is an interrogation facility and that they are required to get the truth from some tough customers. 4 prisoners arrive one by one in casual clothes in windowless vans, escorted by 8 guards with AR-15 rifles. These are quiet professionals at all times, who are very proficient at their job, do not answer questions, do not offer opinions or know anything about the situation. The players are told the basics of what happened, that being the operation going down last May in Myanmar Shan State, and that it is believed that one or more of them are in league with the Chow or Chow Choir as they are known there. Each survivor will tell their version of the story of what happened individually, letting them cross-examine each other if something doesn't add up. It's to be noted that there is no love lost between them. Afterwards, they are to make recommendations as to who is to blame and what is to be done. They have 2 important issues to factor in. 1 being, did anyone from TFTI recklessly expose the supernatural? And 2, are any of them under the effect of occult forces? All names are under a pseudonym, no evidence can be gathered, no judge is present, and there is no backing out. Rick and Toby have been pointing fingers at each other, and there is evidence that TFTI went off script. At this point, the primary agents are presented with their secondary character sheets, which list their motivations, personalities, and everything else to do with TFTI. Then we get into what actually happened. None of the primaries or secondaries are aware of the truth in full, but the Chow Choir serve anti-gods that play against each other using them as pawns. Chow Phialak is a godling that protected and molested the Chow Choir in Kayan State and was bound in location TI-20 in Shan State with the aid of Choi Hubwei. The Kayan State Chow Choir shaman wants to resurrect Chow Phialak, and Boyoke Aaron Hitai, a Burmese army captain and contact of Mona's, got wind of it and sent a unit to take him out. The priest was killed, but not before they unleashed a monster called the 3 Hukruk against the soldiers, which phased through their army personnel carrier, killing all of them within, and then disappeared out of 3-dimensional space. The shaman's followers were negotiating with the local Chow Choir for access to location TI-20 to wake Chow Phialak, and then Americans arrived and started shooting. It then moves on to Scene 1, the inquest convened. In this scene, the players control their primaries and the handler runs the TFTI group. Mona is wheelchair-bound, dazed and mostly unresponsive. Rick is calm and grave, Toby is formal, and Jenny seems to be shy and distressed. They each give an overview of the events of May the 2nd to 6th, then the players play through TFTI's arrival. It's worth pointing out that Mona is very unwell and has difficulty testifying. It then shifts to Scene 2, flashback to location TI-19. We go through the scene with Rick paying off a bush pilot to whisk them across the border to the Salween River and then a hike to a hidden jeep and a 10-mile journey to TI-19. They are under the guise of a charitable NGO called Rainbow of Hope International, who actually visited the village 5 years ago, and Rick has a contact in a prosperous villager called Uliang. It then goes on to talk about the different responses that different people speaking in different languages get from the villagers, from speaking in Burmese, Thai and even Chow Choir, and dependent on the sex of the person speaking to the person they are speaking to, even mentioning that some houses have Chow Choir markings on their doors can get varied responses. It's quite a lot to take in here. We then jump to Scene 3, cross-examination. Here it suggests that the primaries and secondaries are on facing sides of a table to enhance the feeling of interrogation, while they plug them with questions surrounding the operation. The 3 active characters, Jenny, Rick and Toby, all agree that Mona told them to stay put while she went off on her own. If at any point proceedings are feeling tranquil, it suggests having Mona lurch forward in a chair, screaming in both English and Chow Choir. We then move on to Scene 4, the ambush, Toby's tale. We flash back to the secondary characters, with the active players using the Toby's tale handouts, more on those later. This section involves yet more exposition and confusion as to who said what, where Nang Lwin, a local middle-aged woman thinking that they are CIA agents, urging them to kill the Chow Choir, who are currently taking a 7-lock devil box up the hill. The secondaries are led to a small hill overlooking location TI-20, where they can observe a group of men from the village bringing a large, ornate metal box there. There are several given reasons, but a firefight breaks out with the men and their armed guards start returning fire. This is the part where Pete dies. If the players defeat the Chow Choir or they flee, the secondaries can investigate the box. It is covered in geometric engravings, and if it is opened it contains a crusty mummy in decayed robes, although the contents of the box can be varied, as you can also have a red mist escape if dropped. Time then shifts again to Scene 5, Discussion and Dissent, Rick's Tale. This scene can be played 2 ways. An action scene in the immediate aftermath of the gunfight in which Pete died, or a rage and guilt-soaked blame game where everyone points the finger at everyone else. It also talks about the plot immunity that the players should now understand that they have, and that in Rick's tale the entire village was now totally against the agents. This whole scene culminates in the agents fleeing towards location TI-20. We then move on to scene 6, Courtroom Clarifications. At this point, Rick and Toby's scenes should contradict each other, with the players using a mix of primary and secondaries, and this part should be kept fairly short. After this, we move on to scene 7, the Abominable Temple of Location TI-20, Jenny's Tale. Here we get events from Jenny's point of view, with the whole point being made to make her look blameless, whether she throws the others under the bus or not. She'll play Rick and Toby off as being rotten to the core racists and sexists. The secondaries end up at Location TI-20, a hill with a temple inside it, the centre of the Chow Choir influence, where a fight is broken out between the locals from Location TI-19. There are a few options available here. They can identify the Chow Choir sympathisers and attack them only, calm the brawl down, wade in indiscriminately, or even back the wrong pony by killing the anti-Chow Choir villagers. Either way, the team winds up in the temple on the hill. The players will need to come up with reasons as to why they are there. There is also a chance that they were captured and imprisoned. Each player is taken aside and it is explained to them how they escaped. Rick bribes his way out, Toby fights his way out, Jenny remembers something moist and cold touching her in the darkness, leaving a residue that evaporated on her skin like alcohol before her bonds fell away, not something she will admit. And Mona negotiated with the Chow Choir High Priestess, swearing loyalty to Choi Hub-wei in return for the rescue of the rest of her task force. This is when the bomb hits near the temple and everyone flees, finding Mona later on. Should the secondaries enter another way, inside they find a huge grotesque idol behind a horrific altar. Jenny can read the inscription which says Chal Deok Fialak, the singer in the skin. Mona has a strange reaction to the altar, with each secondary writing down what they believe the reaction to be. At this point they hear signs of more Chow Choir approaching, and then there is the sound of jet engines as 5 Chinese-built A5Cs streak towards the temple unleashing explosives. At this point the agents should be asked how they get away from the temple. Consistency is unnecessary here. We then shift to scene 8, closing arguments. This is where the secondaries can argue over who is to blame, with an emphasis on highlighting the smallest discrepancies in the story. It's clear that if someone is blamed and are considered a serious enough threat, Delta Green will have them killed. It's also suggested that the only reason for this trial is that it's clear that somebody crossed to the other side to buy freedom. Finally, we have scene 9, the verdict. Each primary now has to decide which version is the truth and who is to blame, and it has to be made clear that this cannot be flippant as it will potentially cost lives. If they do nothing, they could be leaving a Chow Choir sympathiser operating within Delta Green. The scenario presents us with a whole slew of possibilities, from each person individually taking the fall, to everyone and nobody taking the fall. There are various consequences down the line whatever happens, whether this be sand loss for condemning potentially innocent people to death, to gaining allies amongst those who are acquitted. After the mission, the primaries can, should they wish to, violate Delta Green protocol by checking up on the fate of the secondaries, though this could lead to further sand loss. The final part is each of the secondary agents detailed. They all have a timeline that stretches from May the 2nd to May the 10th, and it also outlines their opinions on the other members of Task Force TI, as well as giving us their character sheets fully statted out, including the dead agent Pete. We also have a neutral timeline which just gives us the facts. After this we have cards that are to be given to the various secondaries, which give them behavioural tips that they need to follow in the scenes of other players that exaggerate some of their negative character traits. We also have a really clever description of what ACLO actually is. It is defined as the written form of the Chow Choir language that is actually a paranormal linguistic virus that destroys your ability to understand other languages as you become fluent in it. The speaker filters everything through a lens of paranoia, where you see other people's ideas and actions as a result of selfish cruelty. There are notes on how Mona speaks since her injuries, and some information on the Chow Choir and how Jenny and Toby perceive them, basically as an extreme cultural outlier that has no concept of love and values physical and psychological dominance over all else. Finally, we have a primer on Myanmar and location TI-19. The Star Chamber is a very strange scenario. I made multiple aborted attempts at reading this, as initially it was so difficult to follow the narrative that I gave up. Once I eventually buckled down and took the time to understand it, I was at first really disliking the way it's put together, as I felt that it was a bit of a confusing mess, but when I finally reached the character sheets and the cue cards and read them, the penny finally dropped and everything suddenly made sense. The scenario seems like it is designed to confuse the players because, quite honestly, nothing about what happens is clear, which I feel is reflected in my review, as the narrative has so many small subtleties that it would have taken hours to explain. Everyone is to blame for what happened in their own way, and although one could argue that Mona should have kept better control over her team, her making the deal to join the Chow Choir to save the lives of her compatriots could be considered a noble one that unfortunately nobody ever finds out about. The scenario highlights the frailties of the human experience, and through the Star Chamber, an attempt to put some sort of order on a chaotic situation. Early on, I genuinely thought this adventure stunk as I just couldn't get my head around it, but by my second full read-through, after understanding the motives of the secondaries, I'm glad to admit that I was wrong. For me, this would be a great opportunity for a handler to bring in another group of players to run the secondaries, if that were possible, as I feel that this would deliver the most impact. But I also feel that all players would have to buy into the concept of the scenario and agree to put aside their character's biases in order to be fair. But I think that with the right group, this could be something incredibly memorable. I do think that some improvements could be made to the layout, as you really need to understand the motives of the secondaries and how they see each other to really understand the core of the scenario. And I would advise anyone planning to run this to read the synopsis, then jump ahead and take time to understand the characters before proceeding with the flashbacks, as you will then properly understand what is going on. You may only run this kind of scenario once for your group, as I think more than once would make it far less effective, but if you got it right, the Star Chamber would truly shine. I give it a 9 out of 10. My next and final review in this series will be the Observer Effect, so until then, bud out.